Good afternoon, everyone. May I have everyone's attention? Yeah, thanks. And first of all, welcome all of you, and apologies for keeping you waited for some time. So here we are in the 18th lecture of the Regional Resource Center for Elementary Education. As you all know, I hope all of you know, that RRCEE was conceptualized to provide opportunities and spaces for interaction between universities and schools in a spirit of mutual collaboration. Situated in Central Institute of Education, University of Delhi, RRCEE is built on the understanding that qualitative changes in educational practice can come only about when teachers' conscious effort go into conceptualizing and reflecting on their practice. To enable this, we believe that it is imperative to work with various actors: teachers, teacher educators, student teachers, researchers, and other institutions. And I would be really happy to welcome you all in the public lecture series that RRCEE holds from the last 10 years. It is our 18th public lecture in these years. And these are the spaces where we try and have a dialogue around things that affect education. And we are joined by Dr. Barbara Christophe today, who is the head of Memory Cultures Research Forum at Germany. And the talk will be chaired by Dr. Manish Jain, who is currently an assistant professor at the Ambedkar University. He teaches in the School of Education Studies. Prior to that, he has been a school teacher for 10 years. And I'm very happy to also tell you that he has been awarded his PhD from Central Institute of Education in the year 2009, if I'm not wrong. And for that PhD, he was awarded the fellowship by Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute and CSJS. He has been also a member of different committees on teacher education, textbooks, and syllabus. And it's really an honor, sir, to have you here, and Dr. Christophe here. And I would request you to please introduce Dr. Christophe for the lecture.
Friends, today we are going to have a talk about memory cultures. First of all, I wish to apologize on behalf of both Barbara and myself that we are starting late. We had reached on time, but certain matters of hospitality took a bit time. For me also, it's a journey down the memory lane. 21 years back in 1994, I came to CIE as a student, and I attended my B.Ed orientation here with several teachers, many of whom have retired since then. And today, being at one's alma mater institution, introducing a senior colleague is obviously an opportunity of honor. And I wish to thank the Regional Resource Center for Elementary Education for giving me this opportunity. Dr. Barbara Christophe is today going to talk, as you would have seen in the invitation for the seminar, Teaching the Cold War Memory Practices in the Classroom. Generally, in India, especially where we have a lot of debates about history and memory, in relation to the sphere of education, we have been caught up in debates about history, but we have not paid much attention to memory. But I would like to share it with Barbara and you that Indian historians in the area of oral history and memory culture, there has been a lot of work, and even in the domain of political science, people have started looking at issues of memory in relation to politics, and it has been approached from various angles. So what is unique in today's talk, which Barbara will be speaking about, is she is speaking about a period when many of us may not have been born. The era of Cold War, which ended with dissolution of USSR and other countries. And she is trying to understand, on the basis of her research in East European countries, erstwhile Soviet countries, as well as in Western Europe, what did Cold War mean? And what do people who live in contemporary times make sense of a time which is gone by? And how the interpretations of that period, which are offered by textbooks and teachers, they interact to make sense of the time? How do young people who are constantly exposed to a variety of media influences and not just dependent on textbooks, they read textbooks? And how do teachers who grew up in that period of Cold War and were socialized to look at the other as enemy, how then they play their role as teachers when they teach about a time in which they themselves had lived? Dr. Barbara Christophe, as Kriti shared, is the head of the Memory Cultures Forum at Georg Eckert Institute for International Textbook Research, Braunschweig, Germany. I had opportunity recently to be a fellow there, and I can share with you, it's a unique institution in the world, one of its kind, really one. It has collection of more than 100 countries' textbooks from social sciences. So you get textbooks from 18th century from Germany and from 19th century from different countries, and there is a significant collection of textbooks from India as well in Germany in that institute. Her own research focuses on transition studies, peace and conflict research and memory cultures. Her research has involved examining concepts of Europe in Polish, Romanian, Greek and Turkish history textbooks and memories of socialism in Kyrgyzstan and Lithuania through two different kinds of textbooks. One, the official textbooks, and second, biographical narratives of history teachers, which we haven't done much in India. I was talking to Barbara. She herself knows 4 languages besides German and English. She also knows Lithuanian, Georgian and Russian. So, and at a very late age, she learnt many of these languages to undertake these researches. So that can, as students of education, may also be a learning for us, that if we are interested and passionate about learning something, which Barbara is, about these memory cultures, then you pursue a trajectory for that. She has also been part of international joint research project teaching the Cold War memory practices in classroom, which is comparing Sweden, Germany and Switzerland and how these schools approach the memories of Cold War. I welcome you, Barbara, to this historic institution, and Professor Sadhana Saxena, who is head and dean, has also joined us. You may kindly start. Thank you. We'll take up questions in both Hindi and English.
Thank you very much, Manish, for this very kind introduction. And secondly, I'm really very glad, maybe even overwhelmed by the opportunity to speak in front of so many people. Actually, I'm a trained anthropologist and I'm teaching anthropology at German universities. And there you end up with classes of maximum 20 people and then you are lucky. So this is really a very rare opportunity for me. As Manish already said, I'm talking today about my current project on remembering the Cold War. Actually, at the moment, we are a bit thinking about expanding that project to other countries, maybe including India as well. So this is one of my reasons, and therefore I'm really happy to have the opportunity to discuss and share first theses and insights with you. As the announcement said, I'm actually going to do 2 things. First, I will give you a short overview over the project. I will mainly do so by providing you answers to a couple of the notorious what, why, and how questions. And second, I will present some of our first findings on textbook analysis, focusing at the same time on methodological issues. Let me quickly start with a question of what we are basically doing. As the title already says, we are investigating how the memory of the Cold War is negotiated in the classroom. In the classroom of 3 different countries, Germany, Sweden and Switzerland. I'm afraid that does not give you really a clue of how we do look into what we call memory practices. Let me elaborate a bit on that. We mainly follow a 3-step program in our project. Firstly, we study representations of the Cold War in 2 types of memory texts, in history textbooks and in life story interviews with teachers. Secondly, we observe teachers' practices of appropriating textbook narratives in 3 types of settings. While telling their life story, when a person tells the story of his life, you can always ask the question, what are the discourses that influence him in choosing what would be relevant topics and what would be not so relevant topics? And when you deal with history teachers, you have to be aware they are the ones to work every day with history textbooks. So you can expect the narrations conveyed in history textbooks to exercise a certain influence on the way they will present the story of their lives. So what is what we are mainly doing in this part? And then we look in the way they appropriate textbook narratives while speaking aloud about textbook quotes. That actually means we present them with textbook quotes we have selected beforehand, and we mainly select what we call ambivalent textbook quotes. It is quotes in which you can read different meanings in, and we are interested in what kind of meaning particular teachers would read into them. You will understand that much better after I've talked a bit about the results of our textbook analysis. And then thirdly, we want to know how teachers deal with textbooks while teaching. That is, we do videography of selected history lessons. This is, by the way, in Germany, the most complicated part because you need to do a lot of work on getting the bureaucratic permits to really install a video camera inside a classroom. And last but not least, we observe students' practices of appropriating narratives as conveyed not only by textbooks, but also by teachers. And we do that again with the students in 2 types of setting in the classroom. So we observe them during the history lessons, and we conduct focus group discussions with them. To reframe our research program in a somewhat different theoretical language, we are looking at the dynamics that unfold in the triangle between textbook teachers and pupils. As you now have a more or less vague understanding of what we are doing, I would for a moment like to engage in an attempt of self-justification. To say it in different words, I will try to reflect on the relevance of our research agenda on a couple of different levels, asking again a number of why questions. I thereby start with the most fundamental one, asking why should we be interested in memory practices? In my answer, I would like to touch upon different arguments. First of all, looking at memory practices ties in quite neatly with recent developments in the field of memory studies. Actually, what we can observe here is a significant shift from analyzing institutionalized objects of memory cultures, like, for example, monuments, exhibitions in museums, or textbooks, to studying the practices people come up with while using or appropriating these objects. Obviously, this shift in focus does not come out of the blue. It is rather based on a general trend in a couple of theoretical fields in the social sciences. To point to the most visible ones, I would like to refer to theories of practice. What is useful here for us, I think, is the general emphasis on the unpredictability of all social practice. Practice is thought of as something that is never ultimately determined neither by social rules or norms, nor exclusively by individual intentions or interests. Looked upon from a certain angle, we can observe something rather similar in another field. What I'm thinking of at the moment is discourse theory. Actually, quite a lot of authors take issue with what they perceive to be the rather orthodox view as expressed by Foucault. He would be blamed for propagating a too monolithic view on the relation between discourse and power. Instead of speaking again and again about the power of discourse, critics would rather remind us that there are gaps and fissures to be found in every discursive formation. They would thus emphasize the inescapable instability of all meaning. And they would claim that this instability would lead to an ongoing struggle between those attempting to fix meaning and those who are keen to destabilize those fixations. If you buy that argument, and I actually tend to do, you will end up at a similar point as recent memory studies. You will not only study the structure and the rules of what can be said and what not, you will also be interested in social practices of dealing with discourse. Just to mention that in brackets, as a rule, those struggles I've just mentioned are difficult to observe, as they are not always taking place under the eyes of the public. However, what we can hold of quite easily are the leftovers of those struggles. We can render them visible in texts and statements. What seems to be especially interesting, promising, and telling in this regard is ambivalence and vagueness. Ambivalence and vagueness as an indicator of struggle over meaning. To my mind, both ambivalence and vagueness regularly emerge in discourses whenever the balance of power is precarious. Under these circumstances, they usually serve two needs. Vagueness may help a speaker to simulate a consensus that does not really exist. Ambivalence helps to create statements that are open to different understandings and thus work into the same direction of simulating a consensus. As you will later hear in my talk, we include the search for ambivalences into our textbook analysis. To cut a long story short, and in order to sum up the argument I have developed so far, I guess with a focus on memory practices, our project is not only innovative in the field of textbook research that tends to move more and more into the direction of doing research beyond the textbook, that is not only looking into what textbook narrations really convey in terms of meaning, but how people deal with the textbooks. It is moreover located at the intersection of theoretical developments in three fields of memory research, practice theory, and discourse theory. Having dealt with conceptual issues, I would like to return to a simple what question for a moment. Let me briefly ask myself what we are looking at when we study memory practices. I guess we actually pursue a twofold agenda. On the one hand, we ask a descriptive question. We simply want to know what happens inside the triangle. Do teachers and students reproduce narratives? Do they reject them? Or do they modify them? And do we observe differences in teachers and students' dealings with textbook narratives? On the other hand, we ask analytical questions as well. We want to find out which factors do exercise an influence on memory practices inside the triangle. To frame it differently, we actually try to define different types of textbook, different types of teachers, and different types of students that do interact and thus bring about different types of memory practices. This is actually the point where comparison between the three, or rather four cases, Switzerland, Sweden, East and West Germany, comes in. So whenever you are up to come up with a typology, you're well recommended to organize a comparison. I would like now to justify some of the decisions we made. First of all, why did we choose to study memory practices inside the didactic triangle, that is inside the school, and not to mention just one possible alternative among visitors of newly planned museums dedicated to the Cold War? Again, I would like to suggest a couple of answers. My first answer directly refers to memory research. The school simply is an easily accessible research field where one can observe how two types of actors with different kinds of social roles, it is teachers and students, engage with institutionalized objects of memory like textbooks. Just to make that very simple, I mean, try to go into a museum and try to follow people there while they go through an exhibition. This is awful difficult, yeah? But students and teachers, they're obliged to come to school, so they cannot escape you as a researcher. This is a very, very big benefit of doing research in schools. My second answer is based on the assumption that the school belongs to those institutions which have emerged in the modern age and then traveled around the world. Despite local differences in forms of organization and pedagogical principles, we can probably say that schools across the globe do display a striking homogeneity, at least when we are talking about function. That means one can easily pursue a comparative agenda if one does research in school, hopefully not only between rather similar countries like Germany, Sweden, and Switzerland, but also like other countries, India, South Africa, and so on. This is what is ahead of us in the future. My third argument in favor of the school as an almost perfect site for research into memory practices refers to social relevance. Actually, if we look at each of the three angles in our triangle, if we look carefully at textbook, teachers, and students, we cannot but realize that all of them are embedded in different spaces of relevance. Or that adds up, I would tend to say, to a pretty much encompassing picture of a given society. Textbooks, to start with, can be described as a kind of border object located at the intersection of political, scientific, didactic, and economic discourses. Just to explain that a bit, I mean, a textbook is an object of politics because in most of all countries in the world, it is politicians who decide whether to introduce a new textbook or not. They are an object of economics because they are produced by publishing houses who are interested in economic benefit. And they are an object of science because, as a rule, the content of a textbook has to live up to scientific standards in a certain discipline, and so on. Then teachers, they are obviously a member of a certain generation with specific historical experiences, and we can expect these specific historical experiences they made during their lifetime to exercise an influence on the way they translate textbook narratives into classroom practices. And at the same time, they are a professional group, a basic state elite, one could even say, with certain standards and principles, and with the function to convey state-approved patterns of meaning-making deep into society. Students, last not least, are members of different generations and embedded in social media networks. They are expected nowadays to share in specific modes of using media. And last not least, studying memory practices in schools appears to be an advantage from the perspective of practice theory as well. This argument is mainly based on the observation that all the actors that we want to look at, that is again textbook teachers and students, are subject to contradictive expectations and role assignments. None of them can thus be expected to simply implement or enact predefined role models. All of them have to navigate between rules or norms that prescribe different things. Textbooks convey not only dominant discourses, they also mirror social controversies. I will later on show, on the basis of concrete examples, how we can actually trace social controversies about meaning back into textbooks. Teachers are supposed to act as neutral translators of state-approved knowledge and as emotionally engaged pedagogues. I don't know how that looks like in India, but in German didactics, we now tend to emphasize that the more emotionally recognizable a teacher as a person is, the more he will have success in really making his students understand one or the other thing. So, but there's, as you hopefully see, there's a kind of contradiction between these two roles. Yeah, being neutral and doing only what the state commands, and being present as an emotional person, as a personality. And then again, students are also caught in between contradictions. They are assumed to assimilate a defined body of knowledge. They have to prove that they have assimilated that knowledge in exams. And at the other hand, they are expected to demonstrate the ability to engage critically with knowledge. So again, two rather contradictory tasks to be done by students. To sum up my rather complicated argument, if you want to analyze rather unpredictable practices from a perspective informed by a theory of practice, you're well advised to do research in the setting of schools. On the one hand, the school is an institutionalized setting where the transfer of predefined knowledge is to take place. On the other hand, it is a space where actors with incoherent agendas, I've just tried to describe a bit, interact, and thus cannot but produce unpredictability. All that leaves me with the last but maybe most important why question to be answered. Why is it that we are particularly interested in school practices of remembering the Cold War? First of all, I guess remembering the Cold War nowadays involves some rather interesting challenges that can be expected to create a lot of ambivalences. The German historian Dan Diener once described the era of the Cold War in a striking geological metaphor as an errant block which extends in an erratic and strange fashion into our present-day landscape. What he meant by this is that there's a deep and significant rupture that keeps us apart from this particular past. Let me explain what I mean with this word of rupture. Whereas the Cold War period, despite the antagonism between East and West, can be conceptualized as an era of certainties with rather stable political identities being based on rather stable lines of conflict, all this is almost out of reach in our present time. This is to be felt not only in the former socialist East, but in the capitalist West as well, which had consistently and over decades defined itself in terms of its distinctiveness from its ideological counterpart, and which is thus also called to reinvent itself with the demise of the former socialist camp. In the last 20 years, we have actually witnessed a couple of attempts to fill in that void that emerged with the vanishing of the East. From Francis Fukuyama, who had announced the end of history, to Samuel Huntington, who spoke of the clash of civilization, up to Timothy Garton Ash, who perceived a crisis or even the twilight of the West. Against this backdrop, and taking into consideration that the perception of our present-day situation always has a crucial influence on how we think of the past, the competition between and the ambivalence inside the accounts we have today of the Cold War comes as a little surprise. This insight brings me to my second answer of why it is interesting to study the memory of the Cold War in the classroom. Scholars working on this time are currently contesting its interpretation on different levels. Whereas some would argue the whole period would be merely a brief hiatus in the process of globalization, others would claim it was precisely competition between rival ideological camps that spurred first technological advancement and thus second contributed to the emergence of transnational spaces. We observed a similar juxtaposition of arguments with regard to the question of what really lied at the heart of the Cold War. Did it revolve primarily around superpower rivalry? Or did the process of decolonization play a much bigger role, especially looked upon from the present, where decolonization still bears its fruits and nuclear arms race is more or less a thing of the past? Will we mainly remember a nuclear arms race which brought the world to the brink of annihilation? Or will we rather look back with some nostalgic feelings at the welfare state as a byproduct of competition between the two blocs? Again, all these different answers I've just provided you with would lead us to expect a lot of ambivalences in Cold War stories to be told nowadays. Last not least, we take an interest in this period of time because we will find a lot of eyewitnesses among current teachers. And this gives us the chance to study in how far personal experiences, personal and political beliefs and sentiments do have an impact on how they translate textbook operations into classroom practice. Okay, this should have given you the first idea of what we are actually doing. I will now move on and present you some first results of our analysis of German textbooks. Doing this, I will, however, again, as I've already said, concentrate on theoretical and methodological issues. To start with, I will reflect a bit on our understanding of the textbook as a specific genre that informed our research and helped us actually to formulate first assumptions. We refer to two different authors and two different theories that would again guide us to expect ambivalences in textbooks. With the Greek educationalist Eleftherios Klerides, we see textbooks as a rather hybrid genre, which does not only mirror hegemonic discourses, but struggles over meaning as well. Upon careful reading, we will thus come across bits and pieces of opposing arguments and claims. We would thus expect to find traces of rival discourses in one and the same textbook. To provide you just one example, the same account may come not only up with a claim that the times of the Cold War were much more threatening than our present days due to the horrors of nuclear arms race, but also argue that due to better social welfare institutions, a lot of people were much better off in these previous times. Okay, this is on textbook as a hybrid genre. With the German historian Habbo Knoch, we additionally conceptualize the textbook as a dynamic palimpsest, one of these manuscripts in the Middle Ages from which the text has been either scraped or washed off so that the page can be reused. Traces from narratives that had been produced in different times can thus be found in one and the same text. To illustrate this again with one example, we can expect one and the same textbook to paint rather contradictory pictures of the United States. Partly they are still influenced by the stereotypes from the times of the Cold War, when America would be mainly equated with noble principles like democracy and freedom. Partly they are affected by the rather nasty experiences from the post-Cold War era, when the image of the US had been compromised by things like Guantanamo or the recent NSA scandals. Basically, these theoretical approaches to textbooks and the assumptions they support have led us to develop a methodology for analysis which would allow us to trace and to gauge the share of ambivalences in narrations. To be more concrete, we came up with a coding scheme that operates on two different levels and allows us to find answers on two different types of questions. On the first level, we ask what kind of images a particular textbook draws from main actors. We look for the extended self. It is, from a German perspective, the West, including the USA, thank you very much, the USA and West Germany. And we take an interest in the extended other. It is the USSR and East Germany. So we call it code for self and other. The coding for images of self and other can refer to the theoretical literature on the Cold War, and the distinction made here between traditional and revisionist approaches, which then would support certain images of the main actors. These images, in essence, provide an answer to two questions. Who is to blame for the outbreak of the Cold War? And, to add from a very German perspective, who is to blame for the partition of Germany? Having said this, let me quickly give you some anchor examples for the coding of images of self and other. I start with the extended we, that is the West, and I would like to give you two versions of the traditional image. The first version would approximately say the West was the empire of the universal good. For example, the USA were interested in spreading democracy and freedom all over the world. A second version of the same traditional image would amount to the statement, the empire of the particularistic good. Saying, for example, the US never really agreed to the enlargement of Poland at the expense of Germany. That was a decision taken by the Allied powers after the Second World War. And this second version of the traditional image of the US would put emphasis on the fact that they would have never agreed that Germany lost so much territory to Poland, which then became a part of the rival socialist camp. There are also two versions of a revisionist image of the West, or to cut a long story short, of the US. The first one would go like this: the US as the empire of greed and selfishness. That would say approximately the USA did pursue an agenda of making the world safe for democracy, being first and foremost capitalistic and striving for controlling markets and resources. There's at the same time a particularistic version of this revisionistic image that would say the US did not only prevent the expulsion of Germans from Eastern Europe, they actually agreed on that. So that would amount to the statement, the US is an empire that never really cared for us. I would now come to the image of the extended other. And I start again with a traditional version, putting the USSR into the center. The USSR in the first version as the empire of the ideological evil, saying as a communist power, the USSR is inevitably pursuing an agenda of expansion. They cannot but be different because they are communists, they need to expand. The second version of the same traditional image would say the USSR is a backward, aggressive, and therefore evil empire. As a backward power, the USSR, like Russia, strives for expansion in order to compensate for its weakness. But there are also two versions of a revisionistic image of the USSR. The first one would stress that the Soviet Union was a defensive power, saying confronted with a capitalist and thus expansive opponent, and moreover, as a consequence from a tragic history, the USSR cannot but have a huge desire for security. The second version of the revisionistic image would see the USSR as a power caught in security dilemmas, by the way, similar to the USA. That would stress that the escalation of the Cold War was a result of fear and misunderstanding, and was thus not caused by intention, by clear-cut intentions of actors. Okay, before I describe in detail the coding categories for the mode of narration, you may remember our second level of coding as signifying the degree of stabilization and naturalization of images, I guess I have to elaborate a bit on the theoretical background. We actually depart from two rather banal insights to be gained from discourse theory. First, all meaning is arbitrary, and second, the links between the significant and the signifier are free-floating and thus in need of stabilization. The British linguist and discourse theorist Norman Fairclough we moreover raised the question how, amidst all this arbitrariness, power is generated in discourse. We claim with him that there are actually two mechanisms to be distinguished. First, power stems from fixing meaning and establishing change of equation. One example would be to equate the US with freedom and democracy. Second, power emerges when one succeeds in rendering this process of fixation invisible. In other words, you would even not realize anymore that this is actually an arbitrary claim to equate the US with freedom and democracy. You would take that to be a natural fact. In the next step, we translated these insights into two questions to be addressed to every fragment of discourse. We ask, what is the degree of stability reached when fixing meaning? And we want to know, what is the degree of visibility the text could not escape when trying to naturalize meaning? As a result, we arrive at the following coding scheme. So we have what we call common sense assumption, mainly in line with Norman Fairclough, which has a high degree of stability and a low degree of visibility. Then we have justification, having a low degree of stability and a high degree of visibility. So you can, while reading a statement that can be coded as a justification, you can still see the efforts of the author to fix meaning, to really convince you, yes, USA, this is freedom and democracy. And then we have ambivalences, having a low degree of stability and a low degree of visibility. In order to render the scheme more plausible, I will now show you some examples of coded textbook quotes. I'm moreover going to analyze those quotes so that we can better understand the inner mechanisms that make common sense assumptions, justifications, and ambivalences work. In the end, we should be able to come up with more precise definitions of what common sense assumptions, justifications, and ambivalences are. I start with an anchor example for common sense that reads like this. The most important aim after the war was the reconstruction of the own country. The Soviet Union wanted to use German reparation deliveries and American credits to achieve this. On the long run, the head of state Stalin feared a conflict with the USA and other capitalist states. As we can see here, there are actually two mechanisms that make this common sense assumption work. According to the general logic inherent to common sense assumptions, you as a reader need to mobilize previous knowledge in order to understand a claim. This knowledge is implied as being commonsensical, and thus there's no need to spell it out. In this case, the commonsensical knowledge would be the USSR, devastated and weakened by the war, could not but be mainly interested in recovery. And second, the USA, as a capitalist state, are naturally inclined to expansion. There's thus a good reason to fear them. But there's a second rather interesting feature. You need to have some previous knowledge on how to link these two claims with one another. In this case, you can be expected to reconstruct the following causal chain between the statements. The USSR, being mainly interested in recovery, would not have a problem with cooperating with the USSR. Second, it is due to the capitalist nature of the USA that this idea of cooperation could not have been realized. Okay, having said this about common sense assumption, I move on to justifications. Here we can distinguish between two types depending on the question, who is it that needs to be justified? If the one who should be justified is a member of one's own we group, he is defended against a blame hanging in the air, but not necessarily spelled out. If the justification addresses a member of the group of the other, he is fixed again to the image of the evil by dispersing the impression that he had done something good. A good example for justification of the first type, it is for a justification of a positive image of the we group, can be found in a paragraph on the currency reform in West Germany in 1948. The quote reads like this: "Currency reform in the Western zones. The divide between the victorious powers grew wider and wider in the years between 1956 and 1949. The Western powers united their zones. The hunger of the population was elevated with American food. The reconstruction of a Western economic system was supported with credits from the USA. This help for the Western zones could be rendered effective only if the German money would gain in value. The rationing of many products and the control over prices could be cancelled, whereas the rationing of products lingered on for quite some time in the Soviet-occupied zone that became later the GDR." Before I analyze this quote, let me quickly explain to you that actually the whole chapter from which these sentences are taken aims at rejecting the assumption that the Western Allied powers contributed to a deepening of the German partition by creating facts like adopting a currency reform, and thus by introducing a new currency, deepening the economic divide between Eastern and Western Germany. In the quote, the currency reform is justified on distinct levels. First of all, it is described as a sheer necessity. Without the money spent in the framework of the Marshall Plan, which is actually alluded at, could not have had any effect on the German economy. It would have been wasted. In the light of this argument, the currency reform is no longer a cause that might have deepened partition. It is rather an effect of the Marshall Plan, a measure taken earlier and having an almost unopposed positive image. An example for justification of the second type, it is for the justification of a negative image of the other, would read like this. Until 1954, the policies of the GDR and the Soviet Union aimed at reunification, meaning reunification of Germany. Both states were, however, not ready to accept free and democratic elections in West and East Germany. I will again look at details here. I hope you can see that there's a certain turnaround in these two sentences. In the first part, the other, it is the GDR and the USSR, is credited with having done something which is constructed as being rather good. They have suggested plans for a reunification of Germany. In order to restore the image of the evil other, which is in danger of being destabilized by such a claim, the second part hurries up to emphasize that the price they would have demanded for the realization of the German dream of unification would have been too high. They would have asked the West Germans to sacrifice democracy in exchange for unity. If we stop here for a moment and ask ourselves what are the defining features of a justification, in contrast to common sense assumptions, we cannot, on the basis of our examples, define justifications as former common sense assumptions that have become targets of doubt and are thus in need of being destabilized again. What is stabilized in this case is the assumption that the Soviet other could never ever really want something good for us. There must be some kind of hitch. Exactly. On the 13th of August in 1961, he fled from East Germany to West Germany. Why do I remember the concrete day of his flight? It's the day when the wall dividing Berlin in two parts, in east and west, was built. So when he saw that this wall was built up, he decided to flee the country and come to the west, where he then became the most famous leader of the German students' movement. By the way, he then was known as a Marxist and socialist, fighting against the war in Vietnam, against exploitation, against capitalism, and so on. Okay, this just to explain who this Rudi Dutschke was. I have to mention there was an assassination against him in 1968. A German worker shot at him, almost killed him. He hardly survived, but 10 years later died of that injury. And a lot of people would think that this assassination was in a way triggered, spurred by a kind of hate campaign in German mainstream media against him, portraying him as an ugly, filthy communist trying to destroy peace and order in nicely developing Germany. So a lot of people would claim that this guy who actually shot at him did so under the influence of these kind of articles, which really moved him in the vicinity of an ugly little enemy that has to be killed in order to restore peace and order. But let me now come back to this paragraph. I guess the passage is ambiguous because it gives us no clue of who did what to whom, actually. Rather vaguely, it speaks of students' protest and not of students or, alternatively, of policemen as the cause for clashes. As we see, the use of nominalization impedes the attribution of responsibility. As a result, quite a lot of questions remain open. Who was responsible for the escalation of the domestic political climate? Whose fault is it that the demonstrations culminated in street battles with the police? Who made the assassination attempt on Dutschke? Who was responsible for the riots? For 1 second, I would like to switch to another level of argumentation in dealing with this quote. Upon careful reading, I guess it could serve also as an example for a type of ambivalence as resulting from the coexistence of different layers of memory cultures. Actually, it can be read as a proof to the decreasing social power of the patterns of interpretation as suggested or even imposed by that generation of 68. I guess whose members once were even among federal ministers. Maybe you remember Joschka Fischer. He was the German foreign minister. He was a close friend of Rudi Dutschke. But now those generations, they left the positions of power, and at the same time, the patterns of interpretation they stood for would slowly move out of at least mainstream public debate. Yeah, having said all this, I would like to suggest some defining features of ambivalence by means of organizing a comparison with what I've said about common sense assumptions again. First of all, I would like to draw your attention to a striking insight. Obviously, mechanisms that make ambivalences work do have a lot in common with common sense assumptions. If you remember, common sense assumptions can also use underspecified links between two or more claims. They can also render invisible the attribution of responsibility. But if they nevertheless work, it is because the ideal reader is as presupposed by the text would mobilize previously accumulated knowledge in order to fill in the gap left open by the text itself. Having that in mind, we would like to suggest a definition that constructs ambivalences as not functioning common sense assumptions. Or to read the same thing as looked upon from the opposite angle, ambivalences do not give us a clue about what would be the ideal reader as presupposed by the text. Theoretically speaking, we could distinguish between different causes for the failure of common sense assumptions to work or to function. A statement that previously could have been labeled as commonsensical ceased to function because of a change in discourse. A statement is referring to events for which there is still not a social consensus. or two commonsensical but opposing statements. 5 minutes. Yeah. Are combined in one statement and thus start to create tension. Due to time constraints, I'm not able to show you example to all these possible root causes of ambivalences, but I could come back to them in the discussion. For the moment, I would rather like to show you how one can turn this double coding schemes, looking at images of actors and modes of narration, into a matrix that helps one to describe textbook narration even in a quantifiable manner. Yeah, so what we simply did is like counting statements in textbooks, looking what kind of image do they draw from certain actors, is it revisionist, is it traditional, and then again looking at in what mode this image is actually drawn in. And maybe I even stop here. I could say something about the differences between the two textbooks you see coded here, but maybe I can add on that in the discussion.
मैं 5 मिनट में, क्योंकि जो ये संदर्भ था वो भारत से बहुत दूर का संदर्भ था, और जो एक बात बारबरा ने कही कि जनरेशन का सवाल, पीढ़ी का सवाल, तो आप में से जिन लोगों ने धैर्य रखा, थोड़ी बातचीत करते हुए भी सुना, आप सबका धन्यवाद कि आपने मेहमान का ख्याल रखा, कुछ इज़्ज़त का ख्याल रखा। ये कल्पना कीजिए एक ऐसे वक्त की, आप में से बहुत सारे लोग उस समय पैदा नहीं हुए होंगे, जब दुनिया 2 हिस्सों में बटी हुई थी बड़े पैमाने पर। एक दुनिया थी यूएसएसआर की दुनिया, जो कम्युनिस्ट दुनिया थी, अब आप उसको रशिया और पूरा जो ईस्ट यूरोप का हिस्सा मटा है वो था, और दूसरी दुनिया थी जिसे यूएसए लीड करता था, जिसमें वेस्ट यूरोप एक बड़ा हिस्सा था। ओके, 1945 का वो ज़माना याद कीजिए जब हिटलर को हरा दिया गया है, जापान में बम डाल के उसे भी हरा दिया गया है, और दुनिया में लाखों लोग युद्ध में मर चुके हैं, और जर्मनी का बंटवारा हो गया है, कोरिया का बंटवारा हो गया है, और ऐसा लग रहा था इस न्यूक्लियर रेस में कि क्या दोनों देश एक दूसरे पर अटैक करके इस दुनिया को ख़त्म कर डालेंगे। ये कुछ हम अपनी कल्पना करें, आप में से कई लोगों को अगर मैं वह उदाहरण दूं तो वो भी आपके लिए शायद उम्र के हिसाब से मुश्किल हो, जब 1999 में भारत पाकिस्तान का कारगिल युद्ध होता है। मैं 71 की बात भी नहीं कर रहा हूँ, 65 की बात भी नहीं कर रहा हूँ, एक ऐसे वक्त की बात कर रहा हूँ जो शायद आप में से कुछ लोगों ने हाल में अखबारों में या सुना हो। और उस दुनिया में जो 2 हिस्सों में बटी हुई है, उसके बारे में आप कल्पना करें कि जो लोग बड़े हुए उस दौर में, वो बन गए हैं टीचर, और वो अब ऐसे विद्यार्थियों को पढ़ा रहे हैं जिन्होंने ना तो वह दुनिया देखी, ना उसमें वो बड़े हुए, और इतिहास की किताबें उस दौर के बारे में बात कर रही हैं। तो 3 चीज़ों की ओर बारबरा ने हमारा इशारा दिलाया। एक, इतिहास की किताबें जो राज्य, जो समाज, उसकी समझ और उसके ज़रिए हमारी अपनी आज की ज़िंदगी और पुराने वक्त के बारे में हमारा एक नज़रिया गढ़ती हैं। दूसरी ओर अध्यापक जो एक ख़ास वक्त में बड़े हुए हैं और वो उस वक्त के बारे में पढ़ा रहे हैं, और तीसरा वो विद्यार्थी एक ऐसे वक्त के बारे में पढ़ रहे हैं जिससे वो खुद नहीं गुजरे। ऐसे में जब इतिहास के बारे में बात होती है तो कैसे स्मृतियाँ, हमारी यादें, वो भी क्या यादें और इतिहास एक दूसरे को प्रभावित करता हुआ कक्षा के भीतर क्या क्या घटता है, और क्या वजहें हैं कि अलग अलग स्कूलों में, अलग अलग देशों में उसी वक्त के बारे में बात करते हुए अलग अलग चीज़ें होती हैं। आप में से बहुत सारे विद्यार्थी बीएलएड के विद्यार्थी हैं, कुछ बीएड के भी विद्यार्थी होंगे, बाकी लोग रिसर्च स्टूडेंट हैं। आप कल्पना करें कि आप लोग भारत में एक कक्षा में पढ़ा रहे हैं, और 1971 या 1999 के कारगिल युद्ध के बारे में अगर आप पाकिस्तान में पढ़ाते या आप दो अलग पर्सपेक्टिव से पढ़ाते। आज बारबरा मुझसे एक सवाल पूछ रही थी, वो कलकत्ता से होके आई। उन्होंने कहा क्या भारत में सब लोगों, क्योंकि सभी लोग हिंदी नहीं बोलते हैं और एक भाषा नहीं, कोई ऐसी कोशिश नहीं हुई कि हिंदी ही सब लोग बोलें? तो मैंने उन्हें बताया कि जब इस तरह की कोशिश और इस तरह के प्रस्ताव आज़ाद भारत में आए तो एंटी हिंदी मूवमेंट साउथ इंडिया के बहुत सारे राज्यों में चली। आप सोचें कि अगर हमें कोई इम्पोज करता कि नहीं आप सब लोग कन्नड़ या मलयालम या तेलुगु या तमिल, और हम में से बहुत लोग अभी भी त्रिभाषा के बावजूद नहीं सीखते हैं, तो उन दो अलग अलग दौरों और वक्तों की बात हमारे सामने बारबरा ने रखी, जिसके ज़रिए उन्होंने ये समझाने की कोशिश की कि जब हम स्मृतियों के बारे में बात करें तो क्यों हमारे लिए किताबें, अध्यापक और कक्षा में होने वाली चीज़ें सभी बेहद महत्वपूर्ण हैं ये समझने के लिए, जिसके ज़रिए हमारा अपना दिमागी एक सेंस ऑफ द वर्ल्ड बनता है। मैं यहाँ लेक्चर देने नहीं आया हूँ, बट आई थॉट दैट as a member of this institution, a former student, it is my job also to sum it up and contextualize, कि हम देख सकें कि वो सवाल भले ही एक दूसरे देशों और वक्त के बारे में हों, लेकिन ये वो सवाल हैं जो हमारे यहाँ भी अपने इतिहास को लेकर, हमारी किताबों को लेके, हमारी पहचानों को लेके, और हमारी ये जो डेफिनेशंस हैं कि मैं हूँ और तुम हो, मैं और तुम अलग अलग हैं, मैं और तुम एक दूसरे के विरोध में खड़े हैं, तुम मुझसे अलग हो, उसको लगातार रचते हैं, बनाते हैं, और वो रोज़ाना ये लड़ाइयाँ घटती हैं। किस तरह से हमारे एक कॉमन सेंस चीज़ों के बारे में भी कक्षाओं में आते हैं, और कक्षा में होने वाली चीज़ें हमारे कॉमन सेंस को बनाती हैं। फोरम इज़ नाउ ओपन फॉर क्वेश्चंस। आप में से जो लोग हिंदी में भी प्रश्न करना चाहें, क्षमा करें, मैं केवल हिंदी और अंग्रेज़ी ही जानता हूँ, दूसरी भाषा से अनुवाद नहीं कर पाऊँगा, लेकिन अगर आपके प्रश्न हिंदी में भी आप पूछना चाहें तो प्लीज़ पूछें। आई ट्रांसलेट दोज टू बारबरा and forum, and if you have any observations besides questions, if you, since it's also on memory, you may also like to think about your cultures of memories of classrooms of history teaching, then the forum is
Thank
open.
you, Barbara, for an insightful talk that we had about history and history teaching. In fact, I found it very interesting, not only interesting but very relevant for the context that we just spoke about. I have my research in understanding of history, and I have done some observations. Okay, I'm Shalini Dikshit. I've done my PhD from JNU, and I have now been teaching in BLEd course since 5-6 years now. So I have some observations in the tribal communities in India, which was specifically located in the East Singhbum district, which is and I specifically looked at the Santali tribe. They have this mainstream schools which are minority schools, specifically made for tribal children. That the curriculum in that school is the mainstream curriculum which we all study, NCERT textbooks. And what you just showed us 3 aspects of a historical transaction in a classroom: students, teacher, and textbook. So now these 3 dimensions, the way they operate there in that particular context is interesting to see, because you just explain that there is a historical episode, and there are textbooks, there are students, and there is a teacher. These 3 have their own political context. Now what happens in a situation where the teacher has a political context, but the teacher is a minority, supposedly a minority teacher in a mainstream setup? The textbook is a mainstream textbook, and the teacher is a tribal teacher who is teaching mainstream history. Now, so all these factors, and then you spoke about V group and versus others groups, and the way a teacher tries to justify the actions done in the past or the events mentioned in the textbook. Has it ever occurred to you that the teacher, although has a voice, but that voice probably is not acknowledged even by himself, to him? Because by himself, he is not acknowledging that voice, because it's a marginalized voice, and he finds it irrelevant. That particular, I am talking about a tribal cultural history which is not mentioned in the textbook, and the teacher is teaching a mainstream history. What happens in that situation? How does the teacher justify? What I observed is that since the teacher's voice is completely silent, there is no emotion in the classroom, and you said that emotional pedagogue, right? And the teacher in this classroom, in Indian context, in a tribal community, has no emotion coming out in the classroom because he is not sure about how to justify that past. So how does one explain that situation? What I observed was that the teacher completely underplayed the perspective building part in the history curriculum that we anyways lack in Indian classes. But in this case, this was more serious because when the children who are receiving this kind of transaction in the classroom grow up as adults who are, number one, not relying upon their own past, which is their cultural community past. Number two, they are not able to connect with the mainstream past because they don't find their own people, V group, talking about that mainstream past. So they end up becoming completely unsure about something which you did talk about here, but you didn't mention it clearly, is identity. So then they end up being confused about their identity and their alignment with their past. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Akshita and I've done my post-graduation in English literature. Thank you, Barbara, first of all, for the very nice talk. My question to you is, we've spoken about how the different factors from a collective form a collective conscience. But what are your views on the role of time and the role it plays on memory, leading to cultural amnesia and its role in the formation of history of any event? Would you like to accommodate that cultural amnesia into the domain of politics, or would you like to keep it separate? Thank you.
Let's take two questions. These are quite strong questions. There was one question here.
Can speak in this mic. First of all, I'm glad, I'm Harpreet, I've been teaching in Jamia Millia Islamia for last 8 years, and I've done my doctoral work in an alternative school setup. But anyway, I teach education and I take up these debates. One, I have a lot of questions, but I'll ask one. I need a little more explanation of the last table that you are showing here. I need a little more because I am with you, but not completely. So it will be good. Okay, it's fuzzy. Speed. Okay, speed. I just need the explanation of this last table. And also, did you ever compare that one, if you have compared the textbooks of different countries, and that has come up here, but do you have you ever seen a change in the textbook within a country and a different discourse being put through that textbook? Has that also come up? Maybe I missed that point. So one this table and another this question. One textbook within a country has a conflicting thought.
Yeah, thank you very much for these highly interesting questions. Actually, the first question on minority, teachers representing a minority, yeah? I really have not a clue about the situation in India. So I try to translate that. So I try to translate that or compare that with the situation I'm familiar with. And obviously, when you compare things, you always lose something, right? But maybe to a certain extent, you can compare the situation of a minority teacher in India to an East German history teacher in current day Germany, you know? I mean, it's the West one, yeah? So the East German teacher would represent also, at least in political, not in ethnic terms, the minority. And all the values he stood for, all the experiences he accumulated would not be worth very much, right? And if we now ask ourselves, what does he do when he deals with a textbook that represents the hegemonic mainstream approach? I guess the model I've just described does not help us to predict anything. Yeah? We have to do empirical observation. And those East German teachers we are at the moment observing, they do behave very different in the same situation. So we do observe some East German teachers trying to be more pro-Western, more pro-capitalist than any teacher we interviewed and spoke with in the West. So they try to overact, so to say, their conformity, right? But at the same time, I guess that never really works well. You will always find traces of the oppressed voices, even if he tries to play the conformative one. This is at least what we observe. Yeah? To give you just an example, teachers in East Germany now try to find their place in the hegemonic discourse by portraying themselves as victims. We were the victims of the socialist oppressive order during the Cold War. We could not but live according to their values and stuff. We ourselves, we never believed, but we were just compelled. Yeah? And then they go one step further, thinking that this is the hegemonic discourse and saying, you know, we were in the same situation most people were under Nazi times. And this is an absolutely no-go in the hegemonic, Western-shaped German discourse. But this is where you can see how they try to find their niche in the hegemonic discourse, and they nevertheless fail. This would be an example from my empirical research, and I'm absolutely not sure whether this is comparable with your situation just in terms of minority position, majority position, hegemonic discourse. Am I able to articulate my voice? I guess even if you try to suppress your voice, it comes into the place at one or the other rather unexpected place, right? This is what I would expect, but I mean, again, yeah, this is an empirical question, and no model will help you to predict something. Time and amnesia. This is a very, very difficult question, and there's a lot of debate on that. Actually, at the moment in Germany, you can observe a rather dominant discourse saying you can never forget, the repressed will return, you have to speak out, the sole way to healing is speaking openly about the past. Yeah? Otherwise, you will never get rid of the wounds, they will linger on. But if we look at, actually a lot of Germans travel the world preaching this to the world, yeah? Like follow our example. We dealt successfully with all the wounds of the Nazi times, and while we did that, we developed so well. But actually, if you observe memory debates in Germany, it took until the end of the 60s or even until the middle of the 70s that there was an open debate about Nazi times and Holocaust. Before that, you had really that discourse about the Germans being the first victim of Adolf Hitler. Yeah? So he betrayed us, he manipulated us. This was the only thing you could really talk about these times, and the rest was silence and amnesia. So it took or more than a generation. It took the students' movement and Rudi Dutschke in 1968 that it was that public debate about the really painful past of the Nazi times and all the atrocities the Germans committed could begin. Concerning the table, there's 2 textbooks. The results of coding 2 textbooks according to the model I've represented. Yeah? As I said, we run through the textbook. The first thing we did is to identify narration. A narration is something that links 2 events linked into one story. Yeah? This is a narration. Quite often a narration is a paragraph, so you have visual indicators helping you as well. And then we try to figure out what is the actor that is in the center of the narration, what image is drawn of that actor, and then we try to figure out what is the mode of narration dominant in that specific narration. And then we code it. And actually what you could see if we would go into detail in the table is that these 2 textbooks are rather difficult. Rather different. Especially when it comes to coding the US and the USSR. One textbook has much more ambivalent and revisionist images of the USSR, and the other has almost only traditional common sense images of the USSR. So this is actually an indicator of what I talked in the beginning. There's no common sense in Germany when it comes to telling the story of the Cold War. You will have textbooks telling rather divergent and different stories. And I mean, it just started, we read those textbooks and we had the feeling there's something different, but what we could not really be precise about where the difference is. And I guess this is where this coding scheme really helps you to nail down where the difference is. At times the difference is whether there's more traditional or more revisionist image of the USA or the USSR. But this is only one part of the story. It's much more important to look at how many ambivalent and how many common sense images there actually are. That also brings me to the question whether there's change over time. Yes, there's a lot of change over time. Just to demonstrate that with one example, you probably all heard about the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s, triggered by the dislocation of, or the plan to dislocate Soviet missiles on the Cuban island that is in the vicinity of the US. Before 1990, almost all West German textbooks would describe the story as I did it now and full stop, and only after 1990 it would be added that there were American missiles dislocated in Turkey, in the vicinity of the USSR. Yeah? So I guess you agree that adding this information gives a totally different twist to the whole story and to the image you get from the main actors, USA and USSR. So this is a very significant change. In general, I would tend to say on the one hand, the image of the USA turned a bit more pessimistic. There's still a lot of this positive image of the USA to be found in textbook, but there's more ambivalence in this positive image. This is on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have far more nationalistic images. Also, I tried to say that in the beginning, the USA as the empire of the particularistic good. You can have 2 reasons to ascribe a positive or a negative role to the US. Either the US embody the universal human values, or the US are good for the Germans. We do not care for universal values as long as they are good for us. And that means, for example, helping us to claim territory in the East. Yeah? This is what I would call, and this is a coding category we added actually on the basis of the research, a nationalistic image. And not only of Germany, but also you cast a look based purely on narrow national interest on other actors. This is where I would see most of the differences over time.
Any other questions, please?
I'm Rupa Manjari and I'm doing my research on textbooks and classrooms in Jain in the Zakir Hussain Center. My question is, you shared about the textbooks part, you analyze the textbooks. If you could just give us a little bit, even a snippet, like, how are the teachers transacting the textbooks? How are they interpreting, given the fact that they are coming with their own, their own perspectives, their own social location is kind of influencing how they're interpreting. And also, if possible, just a little bit of, glimpse of how the children are, because they are coming, the students, they are coming from an entirely different generation. So how are they receiving that? Because in Indian classrooms, children, the students rarely speak. It's kind of, controlled by the teachers. So I don't know how there it is, and, little bit of idea about that. Thank you.
No issue. Okay, yeah. So, first of all, I would extend my gratitude that Barbara came here and she spoke on a very sensitive issue. I think this is the task of a historian actually to provide, the space to those voices in the textbook, in the historiography, which are so far marginalized. उससे पहले एक छोटा सा मेरा तकलीफ़ थी मेरे को मनीष जी के स्टेटमेंट से, जिसमें कि ये कहा गया कि ये दुनिया दो भागों में विभाजित थी कोल्ड वॉर के समय पे। मुझे ऐसा लगा कि एक नेहरू की दुनिया भी थी जिसको रिकग्निशन मिलना चाहिए। एनीवे, आई मीन दैट्स नॉट ए बिग एरिया ऑफ इंक्वायरी। माय क्वेश्चन इज ऑन द डाइकोटमी ऑफ the experiences of a teacher, the experiences that a teacher brings in the classroom and the content that he teaches in or through the textbooks. So I I'm quite curious to know that how should a teacher resort that contradiction which exists between the experiences of him or her as an individual or the prescribed knowledge in the textbook or the content in the textbook in the classroom. What should be the position of a teacher? That is precisely it.
My name is Prachi and I am doing my PhD research from this institute. I was just wondering, in this triangle, what role do parents play? Because there's so much that students take back home in terms of history, and a lot of it is also influenced by how, or is it that this was not a part of your study at all? But a lot of understanding of history gets influenced by parents.
I have a question. Before this, I need clarification because I'm not even sure the information that I have is correct or not. What I know of Germany is that Hitler's autobiography is banned by the state. It is not. Hitler's autobiography is banned, is not available in the public domain. Mein Kampf, yeah. So this has been a point of curiosity for me always. So I want to know from you what you think about the state's action of doing this, and whether there are any voices of resistance against this act, or and also how it plays out in terms of education. I mean, how certain texts are to be kept away from students and should not be available for wider engagement. So it's a broad question.
So as I start with the last question, I know that you can buy Hitler's Mein Kampf in Indian bookshops. at least I was told. I've not seen it. First, it's not an autobiography, it's a political pamphlet, and you can get hold of it. You can go to the State Library in Berlin and order it and read it. You cannot buy it and put it in your personal shrine at home and pray in front of it every evening. So this is a bit of a sarcastic answer. Yeah, you can read it and you can take the information, but it's not out in the bookshops because it's considered to be hate speech. Yeah, it's openly calling for the annihilation of a whole group of people. So this is in contradiction to the Constitution, to a lot of law, to the idea of human rights. So we do not want our bookshops. This is where I really agree with the current German laws. We do not want our bookshops to sell these kind of materials. And obviously there is a small minority of Nazis in Germany who are strongly opposed to this, and they would, so to say, in underground distribute copies of it. But again, yeah, go to a library, read it, no problem, you're welcome. Then maybe a role of the parents. This is something I really, really, really regret that I cannot do it. But as you know, we are living in the real world, funds are limited, and we are actually dealing already now with the huge data. I mean, we did videography of lessons, and this gives you so rich data. You can sit about that for months and for years, and we simply could not do that. We really regret that, and we have another project at the Institute which does not include international comparison, but deals only with the use of one textbook in schools of different types and areas of different types, and including parents and home, and accompanying students home after school and looking what kind of media they would read, how would they discuss topics with their parents, and so on. So you always have to sacrifice one element, and as we already had that other project, we sacrificed that. But I guess it's a very relevant comment. Maybe a bit on students' reactions to textbooks and to narrations. This is very much a work in progress because we are at the moment analyzing the videos from the lessons, and we actually did not conduct those focus group discussions. We will do that after the analysis of the videos is finished. But we have some first observations from the lessons in schools. And what is most interesting and maybe a bit funny to me is how huge the differences in common sense assumptions between teachers and students are. To give you just one example, there was this one lesson when they did a kind of brainstorming about what do you know about the Cold War. And there was this one brilliant student who obviously had already read a bit of the textbook. So he would cite all the things that I mentioned in the textbook, among others, the Sputnik shock. Does everybody know what the Sputnik shock is? So the Soviets being the first in the cosmos, and the West being really anxious to get along and don't appear to be the backward one. Yeah. So the students would speak about the Sputnik shock, drawing an absolutely logical conclusion from this, saying, and this shows the USSR was always leading in terms of technology, and poor US trying to catch up, right? And the teacher was standing there looking at him, not believing his eyes. How can you say that? So the common sense assumption of people of my generation who grew up during the times of the Cold War would be that strong, fixed equation, USSR, backward, dirty, poor, right? And you would never come up with that idea only because of this stupid Sputnik shock, they would be the technological. The students who does not have that background, he came to that logical conclusion. And there are a lot of these kind of instances where you can observe something like, almost like a little clash between students and teachers, not because they contradicted to each other, but because they depart from different common sense assumptions. And the sad thing is, I mean, this could be turned into a wonderful opportunity for learning, right? I mean, the teacher could just interrogate how do you arrive at that conclusion, and so on. You could, and he could then add and tell how things were perceived in his time, and so on. But this rarely happens, yeah? As a rule, you see teachers trying to fix their common sense assumption in the head of the students, yeah? This is something we observe kind of really very often. When it comes to teachers using the textbook, on the one hand, there are huge differences between teachers. So the well-educated teacher, being proud of himself, would try to use the textbook as seldom as possible. Yeah? He would bring in his own materials. Relying on the textbook is, generally speaking, perceived to be a little bit an indicator of you're not good as a teacher. But at the same time, you can observe among a lot of teachers, even those who would, in conversation, say, you know, I do not rely on the textbook, it's simply bad. Yeah? I do not want to use this bad stuff. You can at times observe him reproducing word by word crucial things out of the textbook. For example, we observe that mainly in Eastern Germany when it comes to denazification, so the punishment of Nazis in West Germany and in East Germany. This is a very delicate issue, you know, because in former times the GDR would claim we were the ones to punish the Nazis, you in West Germany, you gave them leading state positions. Yeah? So we are better off because we are real anti-fascists and you still continue this Nazi stuff. Yeah? And this is in the head of a lot of teachers. And they now have to teach with textbooks telling the opposite story, saying 2 or 3 sentences about how in the West we try to get rid of the Nazis. Better not to go into details, but because if you go into details you will find out not really true story. And then elaborating on denazification in the GDR, saying those communists, they use denazification as a tool to get rid of their political opponents. Yeah? And you can clearly smell and feel in the lesson how the teachers felt uncomfortable when it comes to this topic in class. And so they really restrict themselves from time to time to remember by heart those sentences in the textbook and then quickly hurry on. Yeah? So these are some first-hand observations just to demonstrate where the textbook really come in, even if it is not used. How do teachers walk the line between conveying prescribed knowledge and being present as an emotional person? Maybe first one example how teachers really are to be felt like people with their special biography. I was doing observation in one class. Their teacher was a lady in her 60s who was a member of the feminist movement in Germany. And her students obviously knew that. So they tried to please her with prompting feminist arguments whenever that was possible. So there are, of course, a lot of games of pleasing going on in classrooms, right? And there was this one lesson when they talk about Trümmerfrauen. I do not know how to translate that in English. After the war, there were a lot of ruins in Germany, and mainly women had to clear up the streets because men were still sitting in camps or were missed or whatever. And they are called Trümmerfrauen. And in textbooks you will find a lot of material, pictures, stories about those women. Yeah? And one boy, he was called up and he should say what he read in the textbook.
And he would just reframe the whole story about, oh, that woman that was so happy to go out on the street to clear away the ruins because that would give her an opportunity to have a job and to go out of the house, which is actually, I mean, this is way beyond everything. And he simply said that because he knew his teacher is that feminist and he wanted to please her, right? And she was just like puzzled in what you were saying. So these things tend to happen in classroom as well. But again, coming back, teachers prescribe knowledge and their own biography experience. Actually, again, I mean, I guess this is an empirical question, and this is the reason why it is so interesting to observe different people, because there is no role model of how to navigate between these two poles. They are simply contradictory. I mean, we have in Germany, we have history didactics, yeah? And in history didactics, you have a lot of talk about how it is important that the student learns to deal with multi-perspective statements and how he has to find his own position. And then it comes to exams, and then it comes to questions in textbooks like, tell me why it is like this and that. Yeah? This is an open contradiction. It cannot be reconciled. Yeah? So this is why I actually do conceptualize teachers as being really the poor ones, yeah? who are expected to square the circle. And I think there is no right solution to it. Yeah? The right solution would be to have a revolution in history didactics and stating clear-cut and once and forever, there is not the one and only truth to be learned by heart and to be tested in history exams. Yeah? But this will probably last some more decades to reach this. So I'm mainly interested in seeing really how they deal with this contradiction. Yeah? What do they do with it? There are actually very, very few teachers who would openly admit, yes, I do see this as being a contradictory situation. Some of them do, but most of them somehow think they have to come up with a solution. Yeah?
Thank you so much, Barbara and Dr. Manish Jain. And the few words that are coming to my mind is like history has always been a contested terrain. I mean, there's no one history that we can say this is the factual history and everybody should know it. And being from a generation who were taught about partition of India and all these historic facts in a very factual manner, should I say, I can totally relate to the project. I'm not sure were my teachers born at that time or grew up in that time when partition happened, but teachers were really loaded with value judgment on what happened at that time and who was right, who was wrong, what should happen. And textbooks were in a way trying to play neutral. That has been also the case. So they were not actually taking any side, so to say, but teachers were value-laden. So in the classroom, as a student, I was also a bit confused as to what exactly happened and who was right, who was wrong. So I can totally relate to the project, and we all be keenly looking for the final product of your project to read it. And it has been an honor for us to have you here. And thank you so much, Dr. Manish, for contextualizing it and for the entire audience, for them to understand how these things are so valid here in India as well, and how teachers are so crucial between the textbook and the students. The teachers so very crucial, and their baggage, their burden is so very important to understand, and that will come in the classroom and we should acknowledge it. Thank you so much. And I thank all of you, those who stayed, and thanks a lot. And all the questioners, thank you so much. These questions took the dialogue to another extent. Yeah, they were really great, and they took them to another level. The tea and samosa is there outside waiting for you, and I would like you to invite for that. Thank you so much.